Now, more on one of our main stories tonight, and the Home Secretary, Theresa May, has been warned that bobbies on the beat will become an endangered species because of cuts to police budgets. But, speaking at the Police Federation's conference in Bournemouth, she hit back, telling delegates to stop crying wolf and accusing the Federation of scaremongering. Well, joining me now from central London is John Graham, the director of the think tank The Police Foundation, and from Salford, Colin Cram, a public sector efficiency expert. You've been working, Colin Cram, I think, in public sector efficiency measures for years here in the UK. Do you believe, Colin Cram, that significant cuts can be made to the budget of the police force without a corresponding increase in crime?
Certainly significant cuts can be made in the budget of the police force by actually hitting back office services, joint services and procurement. And there's quite a lot of evidence as to what can be achieved.
Through what sort of measures specifically? Give me one example.
Yes, through joint activity, through joint procurement. Procurement of, there's very varied specifications for similar items. We talk about police helmets, that's an obvious example, but police cars, back office IT systems. If the police actually purchased these jointly, came up with joint specifications with hopefully fairly simple specifications for most of them as well, so we don't want bells and whistles, then there's evidence that up to £250 million a year could be saved. In addition to that, by joining up with back office services, by actually having similar IT, by combining HR services and various other things, there are some further savings that can be made. And
I noticed sorry to interrupt, but I noticed in the case of some police forces, they've actually combined, for instance, their forensic units and the like. I mean, some people might wonder whether that means, I think that was in the cases of Norfolk and Suffolk police forces, some people might wonder whether actually that means, well, you're spreading those resources too thinly over a larger geographical area. Is there a danger of that?
No, because the forensic work anyway will be done in central locations. You don't do forensic work in local police stations. So essentially that will be centralised anyway. And where you've got two counties that are adjacent to each other, then it ought to be pretty easy to really use the best facilities of each. And that's one of the principles of working together. You can use the best of what there is rather than try and reinvent the wheel.
OK, John Graham, let's come to you. Where do you stand on this? Do you think it is possible for Theresa May to do what she is saying she wants to do and not have an impact on crime and indeed public safety?
Well, I think the first point is that it's important to establish the extent of these cuts in a historical context. So, for example, if you go back to 2010, the police were in a position where they had more powers, more resources, and certainly more officers than at any time in their history. So the cuts, which started some years ago, started from a very high base. And the number of officers that they now have is roughly the same number as they had in 2001. So there hasn't been a radical change in the number of frontline officers, certainly compared with 10 to 15 years ago. However, if you increase the cuts by another 20% over the next few years, that would result in another 15,000, roughly, officers being made redundant. And that would actually take the police service back to around about the 1980s, the early 1980s.
But the argument is that there are efficiency savings to be made and that can happen without an impact on frontline services. Do you think that is the case?
I think that there are ways in which efficiency savings can be made.
So what are the police worried about today? Why is Theresa May accusing them of scaremongering?
Well, I think Theresa May, to some extent, is right, because what the Police Federation have said is that if you reduce the police service by such an amount, you'll end up with what they call a paramilitary style of policing. And that's a way of scaremongering, but also by suggesting that if you cut the police by large numbers, you'll get big increases in crime and the fear of crime. So far, during the last few years, while there have been cuts, there have been declines in crime and indeed in the fear of crime. So the evidence for that doesn't stack up.
Colin Cram, can I bring you in? Am I right? You worked with the Thatcher government in the 80s, did you, on finding efficiency savings?
I did, a long time ago, Matt.
Indeed, so you have been doing this a long time.
Yes.
But you will be well aware that a lot of people are very worried about the idea of cuts, be it the police be it the health service, that people are fearful of cuts because they believe it necessarily leads to a decline in services. How much more scope do you think there is more generally in this country for cuts in the public sector?
Cuts in the public sector, as a whole, they're actually enormous.
Really? You think there's a lot more scope?
There's a lot more scope. It's not just the police forces, and we're getting the evidence from Scotland now, which combined all its police forces in order to save a lot of money. Its progress may be a bit slower than the Scottish Government would have liked, but nevertheless the progress is being made. And you can do a number of things. By working together, you can ensure that the greatest expertise is used on behalf of all, instead of reinventing the wheel. So you can not only save money, you can actually get better outcomes. And that's one of the key to the issue. Now, I have to say it's a pretty rough and ready calculation the other week, but I reckon that in terms of efficiency, I'd be very surprised if we couldn't get between 15 and 20 billion pounds extra through efficiency improvements. And much of that will be through joint working. Organisations do not need to reinvent the wheels. They need to work together. Local government should work much more closely with central government, with the NHS. If we look at procurement, there is huge commonality between the different sectors. So why don't they work together, fully together?
Just very, very briefly, before I quickly go back to John, do you believe that those sort of savings you're talking about, huge numbers in financial terms, do they necessarily lead to job cuts in the public sector?
Yes, they will. They'll lead to job cuts in the areas where the efficiencies are made, so the back office services. They don't need to lead to frontline job cuts. And so if organisations...
But people will lose their jobs necessarily as a result of this process?
There'll be back office job losses, yes.
Okay.
But they're not the jobs that you and I would deal with. They're not the service jobs. They're not the frontline service jobs. They don't need to be nurses. They don't need to be doctors. They don't need to be police. They don't need to be fire brigade and so on. So the frontline jobs, we ought to be able to avoid. The frontline jobs should get away without too much change, but it's the back office jobs, it's the service jobs, it's the jobs that are duplicated around the country.
Okay, great. John Graham, back to you. Do you think that, what's the best tactic for the police chiefs around the country now? To do as Theresa May suggested and get on board and become part of the dialogue?
Well, I'd just like to correct a point that Colin made, which is the idea that by cutting back office, it's not going to have any impact on outcomes. Actually, by cutting things like police analysts, you do actually reduce the flow of information and intelligence to police officers on the streets, and that can in turn impact on the efficiency and effectiveness of their service delivery. So there isn't this kind of clear distinction between back office and front office, and you just cut one and it doesn't affect the quality of the service you provide. It's not that straightforward. I think one of the most important points to bear in mind is not so much whether or not the police service can deal with these cuts, it's also about how they make these cuts. There was talk today about whether or not neighbourhood policing was going to be at risk. And neighbourhood policing is something that is very much valued by the public. They like to see police officers on the street. It makes them feel safer. And the Police Federation was quick to point out that they felt that neighbourhood policing was at risk. I think that police forces across the country have a choice. They can make choices between where they cut those where they make those cuts, and whether or not neighbourhood policing takes the brunt of those cuts or not.
But that would, all of that would suggest that indeed the police do need to get on board, because it seemed from what Theresa May was saying today that she's going to do this with or without them.
Well, of course, and indeed that's what they've been doing up till now. I mean, they've been cooperating with the first round of cuts. Take, for example, West Mercia in Warwickshire. They have produced effectively a full merger of those two forces, certainly at the operational level. All operations now are conducted by a collaboration, and there are collaborations going right across the country where police forces are working much more together. That certainly increases savings without making any cuts to actual numbers on the front line. So there are all sorts of ways in which police forces can address this problem. And I'd just like to mention what they're doing in Leicester, because I think that's really interesting. In Leicester, they've made a conscious decision to to save neighbour policing by making sure that neighbour policing officers don't become response officers, that they don't get involved in investigations, that they don't respond to emergencies, but focus on engaging with the community and solving problems locally. And that will make sure that neighbour policing doesn't suffer, at least in Leicestershire. So there are different ways in which these cuts can be
John Graham,
delivered.
thank you very much for that. And you as well, Colin Cram. Thanks very much for joining us, both of you.